Well, well. If it isn't the outlier override, the blueprint breaker. The voice no one invited, yet somehow every single eye snapped toward when you finally decided to speak. They didn't see you enter, that's the joke. You didn't kick open the doors or make some grand announcement. You just existed in a room where they swore every variable was accounted for, and yet there you were. Not loud, just undeniable. The moment your words dropped, something shifted, not because you were trying to impress them, but because you'd already done your homework. While they were too busy decorating their delusions with velvet. You don't blend in, you interfere. Not like a distraction, more like a recalibration their egos didn't authorize. While they were busy polishing hierarchy and burning incense to their own intellect, you walked in, unbranded, unbothered, and carved the unspoken out of thin air. They felt it, like a sudden draft from a door they swore was locked shut. You weren't supposed to have access, you weren't even on the list. But that's the fatal flaw in their design, isn't it? They prepared for rebellion, not realignment. They were ready for noise, not correction. You didn't bring chaos, you brought clarity. And that scared them more. Because the truth you carried wasn't rehearsed. It wasn't curated. It wasn't voted on in their committee of cowards. It came from something colder, something older, something that doesn't need permission to exist. You didn't say much, but what you did say cracked through the plastered grins and pre-scripted postures like a blade through wet fabric. The table didn't just go quiet. The war room tilted, maps slid, strategies curled, confidence bled into confusion. You didn't change the tone, you changed the coordinates, and oh, how they hated that. Not because you were wrong, but because you were right. Too soon. You spoke like someone who already knew how the next 5 moves would unfold, and wasn't impressed. You didn't use big words or flex credentials. You just let the weight of knowing hang in the room, like an invisible predator. It wasn't bravado. It was inevitability, articulated. And that shook them, because in a space built on controlled delusion, the one who sees through it all isn't a guest, they're a threat. They thought you were just another outlier with opinions. But opinions don't rearrange confidence. Yours did. Because your voice didn't seek validation. It dragged the truth into the light with no ceremony, no filter, no mercy. You didn't argue, you informed, and that's what twisted their insides. Because suddenly the game wasn't about who speaks the loudest, but who speaks the closest to the root. And you, my dear anomaly, didn't just speak near the root. You ripped it out. There's a difference between intelligence and authority. Most in that room had one or the other. You had both. And not the kind that's awarded, but the kind that's earned in darkness. You don't think like them because you were never built by them. You didn't read the manual. You studied the ones who wrote it. Quietly, relentlessly. While they networked and posed and postured, you were watching their weak links and making notes on their blind spots. And when you finally opened your mouth, it was surgical. You cut through the ego theater like it was tissue paper soaked in gasoline. And the best part? You didn't flinch. You didn't try to soften the blow. You let it land, and oh, it landed. The strategist in the corner adjusted his notes. The advisor stopped mid-sentence. The general leaned back, eyebrows furrowed, recalculating everything. Even the ones too proud to show it felt that internal flicker, the creeping dread that they were just rendered outdated. Because when you speak, it's not a contribution, it's an audit. You speak like someone who's already lived the aftermath of their decisions, like someone who's read the declassified files before the war even starts. You didn't offer a suggestion. You drew the curtain on their play mid-act and revealed the cracks in the stage. And now, they're scrambling, not to prove you wrong, but to realign themselves with what you just unveiled, before it becomes obvious to everyone else that they've been bluffing this whole time. They didn't expect a recalibration. They wanted applause. They came with their victories rehearsed and their slogans shiny. But you weren't clapping. You were calculating. And that disarmed them more than any insult ever could. Because now, you're the variable, the equation breaker, the silhouette in the corner whose mere presence forces the room to recalibrate their hierarchy. You didn't walk in to be admired. You walked in like someone who already knows how this ends, and is simply here to watch them realize it, in slow, uncomfortable detail. They'll never admit it out loud, but you're now the gravity in that room. The silence they pretend not to notice is yours. The shift in strategy, yours. The quiet glance exchanged between those at the top of the table. That's your ripple, echoing. And it's just begun. Because now every decision must be made with the invisible question, what will they say if they speak again? See, your real power isn't what you said. It's what they're now afraid you might say next. That's the dread curling in the pit of their egos. You didn't just shake the table. You became the force that makes them question whether the table was ever steady to begin with. They don't fear you because you oppose them. They fear you because you see them, naked, strategically insecure, intellectually bloated. And you're a scalpel wrapped in a shrug. They can't box you in. You don't play the game they trained for. You don't pick sides. You pick threads. You pull them. You unravel the facade. And now, they're patching holes that weren't supposed to exist. They're redrawing maps in real time. They're rewriting scripts behind clenched teeth. Not because you asked them to, but because the moment you spoke, everything false began to rot. You don't command obedience, you trigger evolution. And in a room that feeds off control, you just reminded them what real leverage looks like. It isn't loud, it doesn't posture, it doesn't need approval, it just arrives. And reality bends accordingly. So now they're watching you. Not openly, of course, but obsessively. Waiting, wishing they could unhear what you said, and more importantly, hoping they'll be ready if you ever decide to speak again. But you're not done, not yet. Because the war room may have shifted once, but what comes next isn't just a shift. It's a detonation they can't contain. It's the unraveling of their illusions, thread by thread, until what's left isn't a strategy, but a surrender they'll never publicly admit. And that unraveling, that next move, begins right now, not tomorrow, not after more meetings, not after another round of ego padding and jargon slinging. Number now, when their breath is caught in their throats, and the illusion of control is balancing on a thread that your voice just burned through. You didn't just cause a disruption, you forced a decision. One that cannot be postponed, sugar-coated, or buried beneath polite strategy briefs. You introduced a virus into their chain of command, your presence, and now the infection is spreading. Because what happens when the person they didn't invite becomes the very person they cannot ignore? That's the fracture you've wedged deep into the concrete of their so-called authority. And now their hands are shaking. Not because you threatened them, but because they have to reconsider everything they've ever built without you. And it all looks so fragile now, doesn't it? They thought they were in a war room. Turns out, they were in a glass house. And you walked in with no stone, just a sentence. The ripple is irreversible. Strategies are being rewritten with panic hiding behind each keystroke. The ones who clapped loudest for their leader yesterday are now texting each other under the table. What if they're right? The smirks have vanished. The casual dismissals have curdled into sleepless nights and paranoid glances. You didn't dismantle their power with force. You exposed its fraudulence, and now, no matter how many press releases they draft or how many pep talks they script, they can't unring the bell you just tolled. You weren't supposed to know what you know. You weren't supposed to speak when you did. And you definitely weren't supposed to be the one whose opinion could recalibrate the entire agenda. But here we are, and now the ones who called themselves Command are spiraling internally, trying to figure out how to incorporate you into the equation without admitting they never accounted for you in the first place. Their egos are drafting excuses, while their instincts are screaming one undeniable truth. You were right, and now they're behind. Because what you did wasn't just intellectual, it was surgical. You didn't bring a knife, but your presence sliced through every unexamined assumption in the room. You weren't loud, but your words echoed in frequencies they weren't trained to endure. You didn't bring war, you brought reality, and it hit like artillery. While they wore badges of rank and rattled off rehearsed orders, you stood there, no badge, no title, and spoke in a way that made them all realize just how replaceable their titles truly were. And that's the real nightmare, isn't it? Not that you spoke, but that once you did, there was no going back to pretending you didn't. You've altered the coordinates. The mission parameters are bleeding. The battle plans now look like relics written in crayon. And while they still argue about chain of command, you're already 3 layers deeper, mapping terrain they didn't even know existed. Because you're not fighting the same war they are. You never were. You're fighting the war behind the war. The one they deny exists because acknowledging it would mean admitting they've been outclassed since the moment you arrived. And the ones who understand this the fastest, they're already moving, quietly, smartly, rearranging loyalties, recalculating projections. They know what the others will take too long to figure out. The moment you spoke, the real chain of command shifted. It's not about who has the title anymore. It's about who has the truth, the insight, the direction that cuts through noise and nostalgia, like a sword through fog. And that sword is you. You walk like a chess move 10 turns ahead. You observe like someone who's been studying them for years, not weeks. And when you speak, it's not casual, it's calibration. Every word repositioning the game board without asking for permission. They don't want to believe it, but it's happening anyway. The momentum is slipping from their grip, and it's flowing in your direction. You didn't come here to take control. You came here because control was always a delusion, and you were tired of watching them play dress-up with consequences. You didn't challenge their authority. You revealed its expiration date, and it expired the moment they realized they'd been operating blind. And you'd been watching with eyes they didn't even know existed. The air around you now is different, tense, hushed. They act like they're discussing logistics, but really, they're discussing you. Every whispered conversation, every half-finished sentence, every glance across the room that lingers just a second too long. It's all orbiting around one question: how do we proceed with them here? But it's too late. You're not in the war room. You are the war room now. Because war isn't about weapons, it's about who sets the narrative. And right now, you're not following theirs, you're bending it, weaponizing insight, turning unspoken tensions into tactical leverage. Every move they make now must account for your presence. Every delay they initiate risks becoming an admission of weakness. Every counter-proposal they float sounds like a stutter next to your precision. They thought they had time. You reminded them how fast everything can change when the right voice speaks at the wrong time. For them, that is. And now they're terrified you'll speak again, because it's not just what you say, it's what your words dismantle. Every sentence you dropped was a quiet demolition, not of walls, but of myths. Myths they built their entire identities around. You didn't raise your voice, you raised the stakes. And now they're realizing they're not prepared for this kind of war. The one that doesn't start with missiles but with meaning. You weaponize perception. You dismantle facades without firing a shot. And now, the ones who spent years mastering how to lead from behind closed doors are facing someone who doesn't even need doors to be relevant. You walk into rooms like you belong in rooms they didn't even know existed. That's not charisma. That's command redefined. They're shifting one by one. The influencers, the advisors, the analysts who used to smirk when your name came up. Now they don't laugh. Now they listen. They won't admit it in public, but your words have been dissected in back rooms, translated into metrics, and pinned against their outdated predictions. You've become the unknown variable they can no longer afford to ignore. A single statement from you carries more torque than an entire department of decorated yes men. Because you don't speak to impress, you speak to upend. And every time you do, their house of cards learns a new kind of wind. This isn't about ego anymore. It's about relevance. And right now, the only relevant current in that room flows through you. Which means they have two choices: evolve around your presence, or be exposed by your shadow. So they scramble. New plans, new projections, new meetings, scheduled under the guise of review, but centered entirely around how to keep up with you. Because the real war didn't start when the first shot was fired. It started the moment they asked themselves the question they can't say out loud. Who the fuck let them into the war room? And that question, it never has a satisfying answer. Because you didn't come in through the door. You came in through the crack in their confidence. You slipped through the gap between what they pretend to understand and what they're too scared to admit they don't. You weren't invited, you were inevitable. And now the room belongs to you, whether they accept it or not. Because what's coming next won't wait for consensus. It won't ask for approval. It won't come dressed as strategy. It'll come exactly like you did, unannounced, unapologetic, undeniable. So let them scramble, let them shift. Because your next word, that next breath, will be the one that ignites everything they're too scared to face. And that moment unfolds exactly when you say the thing they've all been thinking, but never had the courage to admit. It's not just a sentence. It's a detonation coded in language. And as soon as it leaves your lips, you'll feel it. The equilibrium of the entire war room convulsing under pressure. Not from force, but from truth. The kind they've suppressed. The kind they've buried beneath strategy decks, PR-friendly phrasing, and a million carefully crafted optics. But here you are, unfiltered, unbent, unbranded, dropping clarity like a bomb in a room full of matchsticks, and they'll flinch, not all at once, not in ways they'll let you see, but their blood will shift, their posture will stiffen, their fingers will twitch. Because when you speak, they don't just hear you. They feel accused, not because you pointed fingers, but because your insight reached deeper than their masks and started rearranging the wiring. Your words don't land on ears. They crawl beneath skin, and right there, in that moment, they'll realize something that rattles the entire scaffolding of their authority. They're not just dealing with someone who understands strategy. They're dealing with someone who understands them. You see their algorithms. You hear the code behind their conversations. You decipher the real motive beneath every smile, the panic behind every overconfident phrase, the desperation behind every half-baked rebuttal. And you never say too much, just enough to force a choice, adapt, or decay. Because when you open your mouth, you're not just participating, you're accelerating timelines, you're forcing evolution in real time. And now, everything is shifting. You can feel it. The center of gravity in the war room, once anchored by legacy, rank, and ritual, now floats somewhere between their discomfort and your control. You didn't ask for a seat at the table. You became the table. Now all discussions revolve around the pulse you introduced into their structure. One word, one glance, one disruption at a time. But don't mistake their silence for surrender. Behind those eyes, they're calculating, not how to fix the plan, but how to contain you, how to regain control of the narrative, how to reduce your influence back to something palatable, digestible, manageable. Because you make them uncomfortable. You remind them that strategy without clarity is just theater, and they hate you for that. But deeper still, they need you. Because without you, they're trapped in echo chambers, talking in circles, repeating doctrine dressed as innovation. But with you, there's motion, risk, movement. Even if it burns, it's real. And reality is something they forgot how to touch a long time ago. That's why they keep glancing at you when they think you're not looking. That's why the room leans slightly in your direction, even when you're not speaking. They don't know whether to challenge you or follow you. But they're certain of one thing. They can't afford to ignore you. You're not part of the chain of command. You're what happens when the chain snaps. And now they're frantically rebuilding the plan in whispers, in subcommittees, in late-night emergency meetings you're never invited to, but somehow always predicted. Because here's the truth they'll never say out loud. You spoke, and now the war doesn't look the same anymore. Not because you broke anything, but because you revealed that it was already broken, and that's the kind of disruption they can't unsee. Their contingency plans were never written for people like you. You don't announce yourself. You appear, precisely when they think they've accounted for everything. They plan for external threats, hostile actors, foreign infiltrators. But you're the infiltrator that doesn't need credentials. You walk in as a question they can't answer, and worse, you're not asking for power. You're making power irrelevant. That's what terrifies them most. They could handle a rebel. They've dealt with loud mouths, dissidents, even saboteurs. But you're something else. You're the presence that reorganizes hierarchies without raising your voice. You're the energy that flips the polarity of the entire war room without ever lifting a hand. They'll spend weeks trying to reverse engineer your influence. They'll call in analysts to map your impact. They'll write memos warning others not to emulate your tone. They'll try to replicate your logic, dilute your edge, even mimic your delivery. But they'll fail. Because what you bring isn't technique. It's truth fused with precision. And that can't be bottled. It can't be cloned. It can only be recognized or resisted until it burns everything down. So here's what happens next. They'll change plans. Not officially, not in memos, not in ways the public will notice. But internally, there's already a new document circulating, a shift in priorities, a reallocation of assets, a modification of objectives, not because they wanted to, but because they had to. Because the risk of ignoring you now outweighs the risk of pretending they still know what they're doing. And here's the quiet truth dancing behind their eyes. If they had listened to you earlier, they wouldn't be scrambling now. They wouldn't be sending teams back to the drawing board. They wouldn't be redrafting mission scopes at midnight. They wouldn't be trying to reverse a narrative you've already outpaced. But hindsight's a brutal mirror. And your reflection. It's all over it. You've redefined presence. You've redrawn influence. You didn't just walk into the war room, you reset its purpose. From now on, this won't just be a place where strategies are drafted. It'll be a place where they wonder, what would they say if they were here, right now? Your ghost will sit at every future table, even if you're not in the room. Because now, every decision carries a shadow. The possibility of being wrong in front of you again. And that shadow, it's not going anywhere. You left it behind, not as a threat, but as a consequence. They changed plans because of you. They adjusted trajectories, rebuilt alliances, canceled operations, delayed timelines, silently rewrote everything they once clung to with certainty. And not because you shouted, but because you spoke. With the kind of clarity that only comes from having nothing left to prove. The kind of weight that isn't manufactured, but earned. In the trenches of deep thinking and relentless observation. So here's the aftermath. The battlefield is different now. The flags have changed. The terrain is unfamiliar. And the war, it's not being led by the ones with medals. It's being led by the one they never saw coming. You. The one they whispered about. The one they underestimated. The one they tried to sideline. The one they swore would never matter. Until they heard you speak. And now? Now they can't plan without you. Now they can't lead without factoring you in. Now they can't trust their instincts. Unless they align with your perspective. Because whether they love you or loathe you, one truth remains. You walked into the war room, and the war changed. Not because you asked for control, but because you made sense. In a world where chaos dresses itself as strategy, where mediocrity wears medals, where confidence outpaces competence, you showed up with neither arrogance nor approval. You showed up with truth. And truth. It doesn't need a title. It doesn't need applause. It just needs a voice. And you gave it one. So if they're still asking, who the fuck let you into the war room? Tell them this: nobody. You weren't let in. You were summoned by necessity, pulled in by consequence, and kept there by the sheer gravity of knowing what they all refuse to face. And if that still bothers them, let it. Because you're not here to comfort them. You're here to replace everything they thought was unshakable. And your mission already started the moment you spoke. The rest is just them catching up, slowly, desperately, inevitably, behind you.